The cathedral was draped in banners of crimson and gold, incense smoke curling like veils across the vaulted arches. Nobles pressed close in the aisles, their jeweled robes glittering under the torchlight, while the choir's voices rose in solemn chant. It was a scene meant to display glory, a kingdom united, a dynasty secured, a ruler crowned not only with authority but with the blessing of God. And yet, at the very heart of this spectacle stood a girl no taller than the priest's shoulder. Her crown, far too heavy for her small head, slipped forward until a maid had to adjust it. Her gown, stitched with pearls and velvet, dragged across the flagstones as though it belonged to another body entirely. She was 10 years old. They called her a queen. They called her a bride. But she was, in truth, a child. Beside her stood the man who was now to be her husband. He was decades older, broad-shouldered, hardened by war and rule. He had been her guardian, her protector, her stepfather. Now, by the strange logic of dynastic necessity, he was to be her consort. The officiating priest raised his voice so that every corner of the cathedral could hear. He recited the words of union, words that had echoed through centuries of marriages between kings and queens, lords and ladies. But as the vows fell upon the ears of those gathered, whispers ran like a current through the crowd. Some eyes watched with approval, for the match promised stability. Others looked down in unease, their silence more telling than protest. The girl's lips moved as she repeated the vows, her voice barely audible above the chant of the choir. She did not understand all the words, she had been coached for days to memorize them. She spoke them as a child repeats a lesson, not as a woman binds her life. And when the priest blessed the union, placing her small hand into the hand of the king, the assembly erupted in acclamation. Trumpets blared, bells tolled, courtiers shouted, "Vivat Regina!" The pageant concealed the truth. This was no ordinary marriage. It was a solution born of desperation, of dynastic intrigue, of a crown that could not be allowed to slip into rival hands. The girl's mother, once queen herself, had died young. Her father by blood was gone. In the vacuum of power, the stepfather seized both crown and child, binding them together in a union that defied custom yet satisfied ambition. For the moment, the ritual succeeded. The kingdom had a queen, the king had secured his claim, and the church had sanctified the bond. To the chroniclers who recorded the event, it was a day of triumph. One scribe noted, "Thus was the peace of the realm assured, by the union of the maid and her lord." But what of the maid herself? The sources are sparse. They tell us of jewels and processions, of treaties signed and oaths sworn, but little of the girl's tears or fears. History has a way of silencing the voices of children, especially those turned into pawns upon a political board. Yet we may imagine the weight of that crown upon her brow, the strangeness of a ring slipped upon her finger by the hand of her stepfather, the confusion of being called wife before she had even left her childhood games. The paradox of the Middle Ages was that such unions were not unheard of. Betrothals at young ages were common, though consummation was usually delayed. To secure dynastic rights, kings and nobles were willing to arrange marriages for girls scarcely beyond infancy. Still, even by those standards, to wed a stepfather at the age of 10 was a transgression that left whispers echoing in courts across Europe. Imagine the court after the ceremony. The nobles feast, the wine flows, minstrels play songs of joy. Yet in the corners of the hall, envoys murmur. Some question whether the church should have allowed such a marriage. Others wonder what foreign kings will think, whether this union will be seen as sacred vow or scandalous overreach. And through it all, the girl queen sits at the high table, her feet not reaching the ground, her crown slipping once more to the side. She smiles when prompted, lifts her cup when told, nods to courtiers as her governess whispers in her ear. She is the image of majesty, but also of fragility. Her story begins here, with that wedding day. A day celebrated as triumph, recorded as glory, but remembered, faintly, dimly, almost forgotten, as a tragedy. For this child, bound to her stepfather by ring and vow, would carry the weight of a crown heavier than any iron, forged from silence and necessity. The question we must carry forward is simple: why? Why did a kingdom, a church, and a court all agree to such a union? What forces compelled them to place a child in the role of queen and wife? And what became of her, once the pageantry faded and the crown grew heavier with each passing year? These questions open the path into a forgotten chapter of medieval history, where innocence was sacrificed at the altar of power, and where the silence of a 10-year-old queen echoes still across the centuries. To us, the image of a 10-year-old queen marrying her stepfather seems almost unthinkable. But in the medieval world, marriage was not first about love. It was about property, inheritance, and above all, survival. Europe of the 12th and 13th centuries was a continent of fragile kingdoms. Borders shifted with each war, dynasties rose and fell with each birth or death. To secure stability, rulers relied on one of the few tools that could bind enemies and allies alike: marriage. A union was a treaty, a dowry a ransom, a bride a token of peace. In such a world, the age of the bride mattered less than the advantage of the match. Betrothals could be arranged when children were still in the cradle. Theologians argued that while consummation should wait until a girl reached maturity, the vows themselves could be made at any age. Canon law permitted unions from the age of 12 for girls, 14 for boys. In practice, ceremonies often took place even earlier, with the promise of physical union delayed until later years. But practice and principle did not always align. Chroniclers record cases of consummation occurring long before maturity, when politics demanded it. The church frowned, but seldom acted with severity. Too much was at stake: crowns, lands, alliances. Our young queen was not alone. Consider Isabel of Angoulême, married to King John of England around the age of 12. Or Margaret of Scotland, married to Eric of Norway at 13. Or the countless unnamed daughters of noble houses, sent across mountains and seas before they had left childhood. These girls became queens and duchesses, not because they were ready, but because their fathers, brothers, or guardians saw necessity in their sacrifice. In our case, the situation was even more precarious. The death of the Queen Mother left a vacuum. Rival factions circled the crown like vultures. Foreign princes laid claim to the throne by blood or by sword. To secure legitimacy, the stepfather, already powerful, already in possession of armies, bound himself to the heiress. By marrying her, he silenced opposition. No rival could claim her hand, no foreign king could wed her and steal the crown. It was, in the eyes of the court, a masterstroke. With one marriage, the king eliminated threats and strengthened his rule. But beneath the triumph lay unease. The church had long condemned unions within the bonds of kinship. To marry a stepchild was viewed by many as incest, even if no blood was shared. Canon law spoke of forbidden degrees of kinship, and marriage within them could be annulled. Yet bishops were pragmatic. A royal treasury could pay for dispensations, papal authority could stretch the law when kingdoms demanded it. So the union was blessed, and the girl became queen and bride in the same hour. The people watched with mixed emotions. Some saw in her innocence the hope of continuity, the promise of peace. Others whispered in taverns of scandal, of unnatural ties. Chroniclers, ever cautious of angering kings, wrote little of their doubts, but between the lines one can sense their unease. For the girl herself, the world was bewildering. Her toys were put aside, her lessons shifted from childish songs to the duties of queenship. Tutors drilled her in courtly manners, confessors instructed her in obedience. Her every gesture was watched, every word measured. She was not raised to grow into her role, she was thrust into it, fully crowned, with no path back to childhood. And yet, the system that created her fate was vast. She was a pawn, but also a symbol. In her tiny body, draped in velvet, the kingdom saw its future. The irony was cruel, her very power as queen came from her powerlessness as a child. Here lies the first revelation of our tale. What seems like an isolated tragedy, a girl married to her stepfather at 10, was not aberration but pattern. Medieval Europe was filled with children made into queens and duchesses, their lives reshaped by treaties written in ink and sealed with rings too large for their fingers. Our forgotten queen was extraordinary only in one regard: her story, though once whispered across courts and cloisters, has been buried deeper than most. Others left heirs, treaties, wars to mark their presence. She left little but silence. And so the question becomes sharper: if child marriage was not rare, why was her case remembered at all, even faintly? Was it because of the scandal of her stepfather husband? Or because the consequences of their union would ripple across the kingdom in ways no one at that wedding could yet imagine? The answer lies in the years that followed, when the crown on her head proved heavier than her small shoulders could bear, and the court that cheered her wedding began to murmur doubts about her reign. The years that followed the wedding were marked not by passion or scandal, but by an eerie stillness. Chroniclers record no romantic verses, no sudden births of heirs, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, they describe banquets, councils, and treaties, the ordinary rhythm of a royal court. From these silences we must imagine the life of the girl queen who now sat beside her stepfather on the throne. Her days were filled with ceremony. At dawn she was dressed by attendants in gowns too heavy for her narrow shoulders, the weight of velvet and pearls pressing down like armor. She sat through audiences where emissaries bowed before her, though she scarcely understood the treaties they carried. At feasts she raised her cup, smiled when prompted, and allowed the songs of minstrels to celebrate her beauty, though she was still little more than a child with a ribbon in her hair. The king, her stepfather, now her husband, dominated the stage. He was a man of war, accustomed to command, his hands scarred from battles long before she was born. Chroniclers describe him as shrewd, sometimes ruthless, a ruler who bent law to his will when necessity demanded. To the court, he was both protector and predator, the man who had seized the crown by wedding his ward. And yet, for a time, he played the role of guardian as much as spouse. Sources hint that their union remained unconsummated in those first years. The girl was too young, too fragile, and even a king understood the eyes of the church were watching closely. Instead, she was paraded as symbol, not as wife, seated beside him on the throne, carried in processions, depicted in illuminations as the jewel of his reign. It is here we encounter the illusion, the false resolution that history so often offers. To the chronicler's pen, her marriage appears little more than formality, a contract sealed for stability. She was queen in name, wife in law, but in practice still a child sheltered in silk. Her education continued within palace walls. Tutors taught her Latin psalms, the genealogies of kings, the etiquette of diplomacy. Confessors instructed her in obedience and chastity, as though she were not already wed. She was taught to embroider, to recite prayers, to hold herself with dignity before the court. Her world shrank to a series of lessons, prayers, and public appearances. Outside, the kingdom seemed pacified. Rivals fell silent, treaties were honored, and the union of king and child queen achieved its purpose. The crown was secure. The people cheered her processions, calling her a blessing sent by heaven. For a moment, it appeared that the gamble of the marriage had succeeded. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. Foreign envoys carried whispers back to their courts, that the king had married his stepdaughter, that the girl queen was a puppet in his hands. In papal chambers, bishops debated whether the union fell within forbidden degrees of kinship. At feasts, courtiers drank too much wine and muttered of scandal. The girl herself remained silent. She was trained to smile, to curtsy, to repeat the words placed in her mouth. What she thought, what she felt, history does not tell us. Did she find comfort in dolls hidden in her chambers, or was she already stripped of childhood joys? Did she fear the man who now shared her crown, or did she accept him as she had been taught, as protector and lord? The silence is haunting. It tempts us to believe that she was untouched by the strangeness of her fate, that her life in silk and ceremony was gentler than it might have been. But history rarely allows such mercies. For in time, the expectation would shift. She was not crowned to remain a child forever. She was crowned to be queen, and a queen was expected to be wife and mother. The illusion of safety, of formality, could not last. Sooner or later, the court would demand heirs, the church would demand proof of union, and the king would demand that his wife, though she was still scarcely grown, fulfill the role thrust upon her. For now, however, the chronicles are quiet. They speak of a girl in gowns, seated on a throne too tall for her feet to touch the ground, her crown adjusted by attendants, her silence misread as dignity. It is a false peace, a pause before the storm. But to those living then, it must have seemed that all was well. The king had his crown, the court had its queen, and the child had her silk and silence. What no one could know was how fragile that silence was, and how swiftly it would unravel when the court's whispers grew into open accusations, and the illusion of a symbolic marriage gave way to the harsh reality of politics, scandal, and betrayal. The palace was never truly silent. Beneath the glitter of banquets and the solemnity of councils, the corridors hummed with voices. Courtiers, envoys, priests, and servants carried news as swiftly as sparrows flitting through the rafters. In such an atmosphere, even the smallest doubt could grow into a scandal. And doubts there were, about the girl queen and her marriage to the man who was once her stepfather. At first, whispers took the form of questions. Could the union be valid in the eyes of God? Did the Pope truly grant dispensation, or had gold purchased silence? Was it fitting for a king to claim his ward, a child entrusted to him, as his bride? These murmurs echoed in cathedral cloisters and among foreign ambassadors, who wrote careful letters back to their courts, noting with raised brows the unusual match. But soon the questions turned sharper. Chroniclers hint at rumors that the king had not waited long before treating his bride as wife in more than name. Whether true or not, such stories spread quickly, for scandal was the currency of courts. Some claimed the queen had been seen weeping after being summoned to his chambers. Others insisted she was too young even to understand her duties, that the king's haste had broken not only law but decency. The matrons of the court gossiped. Servants whispered. Priests debated in hushed tones, torn between loyalty to the crown and fear of sin. The girl herself said nothing. She smiled when prompted, curtsied when called, her silence feeding the flames of speculation. It was in this atmosphere that the first cracks appeared in her image. What had once been seen as innocent majesty, the child queen with her solemn face and heavy crown, began to be reinterpreted. Her silence was no longer dignity, but mystery. Her frailty, once a symbol of purity, became a target for ridicule. She is a queen in body only, one foreign envoy wrote, and even that body is scarcely grown. The king's enemies seized upon these doubts. Rival claimants whispered that the union was invalid, that the queen's position was nothing but scandal. If the marriage could be declared unlawful, then the king's legitimacy might collapse with it. To attack the girl was to attack the throne itself. The church was drawn into the storm. Bishops debated whether a marriage to a stepchild lay within the forbidden degrees of kinship. Some argued it was incest in all but blood, a defilement of natural order. Others, eager to remain in favor with the king, declared it lawful by dispensation. The conflict spread beyond the palace walls into sermons and letters, giving the people reason to wonder, was their queen truly a queen at all? In the midst of these disputes, the girl remained a ghostly figure. Chroniclers tell us she appeared rarely, always heavily adorned, her face pale, her voice seldom heard. We cannot know if she understood the storm gathering around her. Perhaps she did. Children at court learn early to read fear in the eyes of others. Perhaps she simply endured, as she had endured the weight of her crown on the day of her wedding. The paradox deepened. For all the accusations, her marriage was never annulled. The king held too much power, commanded too many loyalties. Yet the rumors could not be silenced. They clung to her like a shadow, reshaping how she was remembered. This is the moment when her story turns. No longer is she the innocent child queen in silk, untouched by scandal. Now she becomes a contested figure, her very body a battlefield where politics, law, and morality collide. The false peace of her early years had dissolved. The court no longer whispered only of treaties and feasts, it whispered of her. And though she was still scarcely more than a child, she had already become a symbol, of scandal, of sin, of a kingdom's fragile legitimacy. What is striking is how quickly silence became accusation. The absence of her voice allowed others to speak for her, to shape her story in ways she could not control. Was she merely a puppet in her husband's hands? Was she a victim of his desire, or a pawn of his ambition? Or was she, even at 10 or 12, already learning to play the game of survival, her silence a shield rather than submission? History does not tell us. But the court's whispers leave us with the unsettling sense that the truth was more complex than we can know. And so a question lingers, unresolved: was her marriage truly symbolic, as some believed, or had it crossed into something darker, a union not only unlawful in the eyes of men, but unendurable in the eyes of a child? The answer would never be given clearly. Instead, it would fester, growing into a scandal that reached far beyond the palace walls, into the courts of Europe and the judgment halls of the church. The murmurs of the court could be contained for a time, but in medieval Europe no secret stayed within palace walls for long. Merchants carried tales as swiftly as they carried silks. Envoys dispatched reports to their masters, cloaked in careful language yet edged with disdain. And the marriage of the king to his child queen, his own stepdaughter, was too extraordinary not to attract attention. Foreign courts began to whisper openly. In Paris, the French envoys questioned whether such a union could be recognized as lawful under canon law. In Rome, papal advisors debated the legitimacy of the dispensation said to have sanctioned the marriage. Some suspected it had been purchased, others doubted it had ever been issued at all. If this is permitted, one cleric wrote, then what boundary remains between kin and kin? What had once been a private unease now became a political weapon. Rival claimants to the throne declared that the king's marriage was null, and therefore any children born of it would be illegitimate. If no legitimate heirs existed, then the path to the crown might reopen for them. Suddenly, the union of stepfather and child was no longer just scandal, it was a matter of succession, of the very survival of the dynasty. The church itself was caught in the storm. Bishops who once praised the king now hesitated. Some invoked the ancient prohibitions of Leviticus, which condemned uncovering the nakedness of thy son's daughter or thy daughter's daughter, words that, by extension, cast doubt upon the legitimacy of this match. Others, more pragmatic, argued that canon law could bend, that papal authority had the power to absolve forbidden degrees of kinship when necessity demanded. Yet necessity was not an argument that satisfied the people. Among commoners, the story spread with the speed of rumor, embroidered with details both imagined and true. In taverns they whispered that the girl was too young even to carry herself across the hall, that she cried each night in her chambers, that the king had broken the law of God itself. Some believed the union cursed, that famine or defeat in battle would surely follow. For the queen, still scarcely more than a child, the effect was devastating. She was paraded before the people, her face pale, her movements stiff, while beneath the cheers ran an undercurrent of doubt. Did they hail her as queen, or mock her as a victim of scandal? The king fought back with the tools he knew best, power and spectacle. He summoned bishops to declare the marriage lawful, staged processions in which he and his bride rode side by side beneath banners of gold, and commissioned scribes to record the union as a triumph ordained by heaven. To oppose him openly was dangerous, for his armies remained strong. But opposition did not fade. It merely grew quieter, sharper, more patient. In foreign courts, the scandal was used as leverage. Ambassadors hinted that alliances might falter unless Rome intervened. Some kingdoms refused to recognize the queen's title, addressing her only as the maiden rather than consort. Every negotiation, every treaty, every marriage proposal for other royal relatives carried the shadow of doubt cast by her crown. The irony was bitter. The marriage had been arranged to secure the throne, to prevent rivals from seizing the girl and her inheritance. Instead, it provided rivals with a weapon sharper than steel, scandal. For the child queen, life became a theater of contradictions. She sat beside her husband at banquets, her small hand resting in his, the symbol of unity. Yet behind the hangings, courtiers muttered of illegitimacy. She walked in processions, draped in jewels, the emblem of power. Yet in the marketplace, the people whispered of sin. She prayed in chapels for peace, but her very marriage was said to offend heaven. This was no longer simply a personal tragedy. It was a kingdom's crisis. The bond meant to silence disputes had instead inflamed them. And though the king still held his power, the murmurs grew into accusations that could no longer be ignored. The church would be forced to act. The pope himself would be drawn into judgment. And the child who wore a crown too heavy for her head would find her fate decided not in her own chambers, but in the councils of men who saw in her body the key to dynasties and dominions. The storm was no longer coming. It was already upon them. The summons came from Rome. What had begun as whispers in corridors and letters between envoys had grown too loud to ignore. The Pope himself, pressured by rival kings, unsettled by bishops, and mindful of the Church's authority, demanded an inquiry. Was the union of the king and his stepdaughter lawful in the eyes of God? Or was it an abomination that threatened the very sanctity of marriage? The court prepared for judgment. Bishops gathered in solemn procession, their mitres gleaming like pale crowns, their lips tight with unease. Envoys from neighboring realms crowded into the chamber, their faces eager, for they knew that the verdict might weaken the king who stood before them. Scribes sharpened quills, ready to record every word. The air smelled of wax and incense, heavy with expectation. At the center of it all stood the girl queen. She was scarcely more than 12 by now, dressed in a robe of scarlet trimmed with ermine, her crown steadied by attendants. She was led forward to stand beside her husband, the man who had once been her stepfather, now her lord. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ground. She spoke no words. None were asked of her. The charges were read aloud. The marriage violated the prohibited degrees of kinship. It was unnatural, unlawful, a scandal in the eyes of Christendom. Witnesses repeated the rumors, that the dispensation was forged, that the union was consummated too early, that the king had acted in lust rather than law. The king himself rose to answer. His voice carried across the chamber, hard as iron. He declared that the marriage was ordained by necessity, to secure the crown, to preserve the kingdom, to protect his bride from those who would seize her for their own ambitions. He produced documents, charters signed by bishops, letters of support from nobles. He claimed the dispensation was valid, issued under papal seal. Some nodded. Others scoffed. Then the bishops debated. For hours, they argued over scripture, over canon law, over the dangerous precedent that would be set. One voice cited Leviticus, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father's wife." Another countered that no blood bound the pair, that the law of affinity could be set aside by papal authority. Some whispered that to condemn the king was to risk rebellion, others warned that to condone him was to stain the church forever. The girl queen remained silent through it all. She was the subject of every word, yet never its speaker. Her crown glinted under torchlight, her hands clutched the folds of her robe, and she endured as men debated her body, her soul, her future. At last, the verdict was given. The Pope, unwilling to break openly with the king yet unable to condone scandal, issued a compromise. The marriage would stand, for to annul it now might plunge the kingdom into war, but it would stand under conditions. The union was declared lawful by special dispensation, yet clouded by penance. The king was ordered to endow monasteries, to pay alms, to seek forgiveness for the appearance of sin. The queen was to be honored, but her presence at certain ceremonies curtailed, as though her crown itself bore the stain of controversy. It was, in truth, no solution at all. The king kept his bride, the crown stayed secure, but the whispers only deepened. By sparing the marriage, the church had tacitly admitted its power could bend to politics. By imposing penance, it confirmed that sin clung to the union nonetheless. For the girl, the outcome was cruelly ambiguous. She was not cast aside, yet neither was she vindicated. She remained queen, but a queen under shadow, her name spoken with hesitation, her legitimacy forever in question. Chroniclers describe the scene of her leaving the chamber. The king strode proudly, his head high, as though he had triumphed. Behind him, the child queen walked in silence, her step small, her crown trembling with each motion. No one applauded. No trumpets played. The judgment had preserved the throne but stolen the glory. This was the climax of her story, not a moment of triumph, nor of utter ruin, but of suspended condemnation. She remained a bride, a queen, a pawn, tolerated but not celebrated, lawful but not respected. And the kingdom would feel the weight of that ambiguity. For though the marriage stood, the scandal remained, ready to erupt again with every treaty, every negotiation, every rumor of succession. The storm had not passed. It had only changed its shape. After the council's verdict, the great hall emptied, the banners were folded away, and the torches dimmed. But for the young queen, the world did not return to peace. It slipped instead into silence. She remained crowned, seated beside the king at feasts and processions, her head bowed beneath gold and jewels. Yet her presence carried a strange unease. She was not celebrated, not praised in chronicles with the adoring titles usually given to queens. Instead, she became a shadowy figure, acknowledged, tolerated, but seldom described. The chroniclers turned their gaze to the king's campaigns, his alliances, his victories and defeats. The girl queen was mentioned only in passing, a name among witnesses to charters, a pale figure in the margins of events. The queen was present, one record notes simply, with no description of her face, no detail of her voice. Her silence became part of the record itself. In the palace, she was carefully managed. Attendants guided her every step, ladies-in-waiting shielded her from gossip, priests instructed her to embrace obedience and prayer. Her world shrank to private chambers hung with tapestries, to chapels where candles burned day and night. She embroidered silks, copied psalms, listened to music played by courtly minstrels. To outsiders, it seemed a life of comfort. But beneath the velvet lay isolation. The courtiers no longer spoke of her as hope. They spoke of her as burden. Rumors swirled that the king, though proud of his triumph in keeping her, grew weary of the constant suspicion surrounding their union. Some whispered he sought affection elsewhere, that mistresses and companions replaced the child wife in his affections. Others claimed he demanded of her duties she could not refuse, her silence concealing not only shame but suffering. Still she endured, for what else could she do? A queen she remained, but a queen without power. No children were recorded, no heirs to cement her place. Without them, her role diminished further, leaving her a figure of ceremony only, a crown without voice. The people, too, forgot her. In villages, ballads were sung of kings and knights, of saints and martyrs, but not of the child bride queen. Her story was not the stuff of legend, but of unease. Mothers might whisper it to daughters as warning, but few dared to sing of it openly. A queen who married her stepfather was a queen best left unspoken. The irony was sharp. She had been married to secure a kingdom, yet she became the most insecure of queens, living on the edge of memory, her existence half acknowledged, half denied. Foreign envoys noted her absence from councils, her silence at feasts. She is there, but as statue, one wrote, a figure carved in flesh, unmoving, unspeaking. Another described her as a crown without a voice. Their words capture the image that remains to us, a child who grew into womanhood not through play or freedom, but through the crushing stillness of ceremonial silence. Her marriage had preserved the dynasty, but it had erased her. She became queen of nothing but shadows, her youth consumed by the demands of politics, her name fading from memory even as she lived. The greatest tragedy is that we cannot know her thoughts. Did she dream of escape, of convent walls where silence at least might be chosen? Did she envy the maidens of her household, free to laugh and whisper behind closed doors? Or did she submit wholly, believing as she had been taught that her suffering was duty, her silence obedience to God? History does not say. It leaves her in the shadows, her voice lost, her presence only faintly traced in the margins of charters and chronicles. And this is the cruelest fate of all. Kings are remembered for their battles, nobles for their rebellions, even traitors for their betrayals. But the girl who became queen at 10, who married her stepfather to secure a throne, slips into oblivion, her life reduced to a scandal whispered and then forgotten. It is as though history itself turned its face away, unwilling to look too long at the uncomfortable truth she embodied. But the silence around her is not the end of the story. For even if her name fades, the consequences of her marriage would ripple outward, shaping succession, diplomacy, and the fate of the kingdom long after her shadow had vanished. If the young queen herself faded into silence, the shadow of her marriage did not. It clung to the kingdom, shaping politics long after her voice had been lost. For in the Middle Ages, legitimacy was not only a matter of blood, it was the cornerstone of rule. And the union of a king with his stepdaughter cast doubt on that cornerstone. The first and most immediate consequence was succession. Every dynasty lived in fear of uncertainty over heirs. Kings fought wars to secure crowns, queens risked their lives in childbirth, nobles schemed to position their kin as claimants. In this kingdom, the question of legitimacy became more than whisper, it was a weapon. Whenever rival nobles sought to challenge the throne, they invoked the scandal of the marriage. If the queen was not lawful, they argued, then how could her children be lawful heirs? Even if no heirs were born of the union, the doubt was poison enough. The possibility itself was destabilizing. Each treaty signed, each alliance made, carried the unspoken suspicion, could this crown endure? Foreign powers exploited the weakness. In letters preserved by chroniclers, ambassadors from neighboring realms described the union as a bond of shame. Some kings refused to address the queen by her title, referring to her only as the maiden, a calculated insult that undercut her authority. In marriage negotiations for the royal family's relatives, rivals cited the scandal as proof of corruption, demanding greater concessions in dowries and lands. The Pope's compromise, allowing the marriage with penance, satisfied no one fully. To the king, it was humiliation, a reminder that his authority was beholden to Rome. To his enemies, it was fuel, proof that even the church had been uneasy. And to the people, it was confusion. Was their queen lawful or not? Did heaven bless their rulers, or merely tolerate them? The marriage also weakened the king's alliances abroad. Potential partners hesitated to bind themselves to a dynasty tainted by suspicion. When treaties were broken or wars erupted, foreign rulers could point to the scandal and claim moral superiority. Even within the kingdom, noble families grew restless, whispering that their loyalty was stretched too far in defending a union that embarrassed Christendom. Ironically, the very act meant to secure the throne endangered it. By marrying the heiress, the king had prevented foreign seizure of her hand. But in doing so, he created a permanent blemish that enemies would exploit for decades. His political victory at the altar became a liability in the courts of Europe. As years passed, the queen's absence from chronicles became its own kind of statement. She was rarely depicted in illuminations, seldom praised in charters. Unlike queens who were celebrated for bearing heirs or for acts of piety, she left no visible mark of influence. Her silence reinforced the perception of weakness, a queen unfit, a marriage unholy. The kingdom did not collapse, not immediately. The king's armies remained strong, his authority within his borders largely intact. But legitimacy is a fragile thing. It is not lost in a single battle or treaty. It erodes slowly, like stone weathered by rain. And the scandal of his marriage gnawed at the foundations of trust, creating fractures that future generations would inherit. When the king died, the question of succession returned with venom. His heirs, legitimate or not, faced opposition from rivals who claimed the stain of the marriage disqualified them. Civil strife simmered. Alliances shifted. The throne, once secured by the marriage, now trembled because of it. In foreign chronicles, the queen's name was often omitted altogether, as if her existence was too uncomfortable to record. Where she is mentioned, it is only as a problem, a pawn, a shadow. One French chronicler dismissed her as the child bride, whose crown was bought in shame. Another, writing decades later, noted that her silence was the loudest testimony of the age. This was the true legacy of her marriage, not glory, not stability, but doubt. A kingdom marked by whispers, a dynasty weakened by suspicion, a queen remembered only for the scandal she could never control. The irony is striking. She had been married to prevent the kingdom's enemies from seizing her, to make her the symbol of strength and unity. Instead, she became the symbol of its fragility, her crown heavier in memory than in life. And as Europe moved forward, her story faded into the margins. The scandal did not vanish, it lingered as rumor, as a cautionary tale, but the queen herself slipped into near oblivion. She became less a person than a shadow, a ghostly reminder of how power can consume innocence and leave only silence behind. The chronicles grow quiet. After the judgment of the church, after the murmurs of scandal and the battles for legitimacy, the child queen slips from the record like a candle snuffed in the night. A few mentions remain, her name attached to a charter, her presence noted at a feast, her title inscribed in a list of witnesses. But then, silence. It is as if history itself conspired to erase her. The girl who had once stood at the altar at 10 years old, crowned and veiled, joined to her stepfather in the eyes of a kingdom, is remembered only faintly, her voice lost, her fate uncertain. What became of her? Some sources hint that she lived out her days within the palace, a queen in name but a shadow in truth. Perhaps she retreated into chapels, cloaked in prayer, her crown exchanged for a veil of devotion. Perhaps she endured the king's presence in silence, her life reduced to rituals of obedience. Perhaps she died young, her body buried with honors, her memory left unspoken because it carried too much shame. Others suggest that she was quietly removed from the stage altogether, sent to a convent when her usefulness waned, her crown lifted from her brow as if it had never been there. In the stillness of cloistered walls, she might have found some semblance of peace. Or perhaps it was only another prison, where silence followed her to the grave. No certainty remains. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her tragedy, not that she was scandalous, not that she was condemned, but that she was forgotten. History remembers kings who murdered, nobles who betrayed, even mistresses who seduced. Yet the queen who married her stepfather at the age of 10, who embodied both the desperation and the corruption of a dynasty, fades almost entirely from view. She exists only in whispers, in footnotes, in the margins of manuscripts. A queen without a story. And yet, in that silence, her presence endures. For silence itself is a kind of testimony. Think of her again at the wedding altar. A child in silk, her crown slipping forward, her hand placed into the hand of a man who should have been her guardian. Bells rang, trumpets sounded, the people shouted, "Vivat Regina." But what did she feel in that moment? Did she understand? Did she fear? Did she hope, in some small corner of her heart, for escape? We cannot know. Her silence forces us to ask what the records do not answer: how many others like her were buried in history's shadows? How many child brides, married for power, erased when their usefulness ended? How many lives consumed by crowns too heavy for the heads that bore them? The forgotten queen's story is not only hers. It is the story of countless girls transformed into symbols, brides before they were women, queens before they were grown, pawns before they had voices. They were written into treaties, carved into alliances, used to stabilize thrones. And then, when the crowns they bore became inconvenient, they were written out again. This is why her story matters, even in its silence. Because silence is not emptiness. It is absence that demands we notice what is missing. Her name, faint in charters. Her crown, glimmering but unstable. Her life, sacrificed to necessity. The king she married is remembered. His battles, his counsels, his victories are preserved in chronicles. But the girl who shared his throne has no legacy but scandal. When her name is mentioned, it is only to mark the controversy of their union, never to honor her as queen. And so we are left with fragments, shadows, and questions. Was her marriage truly consummated, or was it only ever symbolic? Did she die young, or did she live long in silence, her days marked by ritual and resignation? Was her memory erased deliberately, to cleanse the dynasty of its stain, or simply lost because she was never allowed to act, to speak, to leave her mark? History does not give us answers. It gives us only the silence of a queen forgotten. But in that silence lies an unsettling truth. Dynasties rise and fall, crowns glitter and fade, kings leave their names in stone. Yet behind those names lie the faces of children sacrificed to power. Their stories, if told at all, are whispered at the edges. Their crowns are forged not of gold but of silence. And so we return to the image with which this story began, a child queen at the altar, her crown slipping forward, her lips repeating vows she scarcely understood. Around her, men cheered, priests blessed, scribes recorded. But no one asked what she felt, what she thought, what she feared. Her crown weighed heavier than iron, because it was forged from silence. And that silence, carried across centuries, still asks us, what is the worth of power if it is bought with the lives of children? And how many more queens, forgotten in shadows, lie waiting for history to remember them?